All right, guys, so if you follow us on Dave Tate's Table Talk at all, you'll know that over the last couple episodes, we've had awesome guests like Dr. Jordan Shallow and Dr. Stuart McGill. I had amazing conversations. Check them out above me or below me, wherever they're going to be. And I gained a ton of awesome information on how to train your core appropriately, how to train very specific exercises for very specific goals. But the information I got to have in these conversations, now I want to share with you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you over to the whiteboard and we're going to go over the 4 categories of core training, how to figure out where you fit on this spectrum, and how you can pick the best exercises to make sure that you are getting the most out of your training and you hit all of your strength goals. So let's hop right over there. All right, guys, so when we're talking about core training, before we even break into this model, shout out to Jordan Shallow and the Prescript team. This is 100% coming from them. I am just regurgitating this for the audience here. Also, shout out to Dr. McGill, whom I've learned quite a bit of core training information from. And what we want to kind of talk about today is understanding core training in a very principle-based approach, right? So when you're talking about core training specifically, you kind of have these 2 spectrums that you're working on. Static to dynamic, or isolated versus integrated. What that means sounds very complicated. Is essentially what you're looking at is how you are performing the exercise and the purpose of the core in that exercise. So, for example, I have 4 different blocks here. We have static isolated, static integrated, dynamic isolated, and dynamic integrated. I'm going to be going over each and every single one of these with examples, but I just wanted to show you the entire framework of what we're looking at so you can start kind of trying to understand what I mean by these things. So, static and dynamic. What I mean with these is how you're performing the exercise. Either the core is trying to resist motion and movement, and you're trying to hold a position, or you are moving freely through a position and having that core kind of work as it should on a more functional basis. Same thing when it comes to isolated versus integrated. Isolated, we're trying to focus primarily on the core musculature itself, the action of that muscle going from origin to insertion, versus integrated, how that core works with the rest of the body, how it functions, and how you can maintain good positions throughout the exercise that we're going through. So again, 2 different spectrums that we're talking about core training, 4 different sort of blocks you can fit all sort of core training into. So let's jump into each and every single one of these with examples over here. So when it comes to static isolated exercises, you got to think about these as the big 3 exercises from Dr. McGill. Anything where we are trying to just lock the core down and resist movement entirely. And the main focus of the exercise is the function of the core, and it's that anti-movement. So just like with anything else, we want to hit the core from 360 degrees. So we have a very good video going into in-depth on the McGill Big 3, how to execute these and how to ramp them up in terms of difficulty or regress them in terms of making sure that they fit your rehab or your training or wherever your skill level is. But a brief overview of static isolated exercises for your core would be something like a front plank, right? You lock in, maintain that tension, and resist movement. Same thing with that side plank. The goal is to resist movement through that side of the core, through the obliques, locking that in, locking that lat in, and again, resisting movement in a static position. Finally, to get the back, we have the bird dog. Same idea. You want to holding those positions, maintaining those positions, and resisting force so the individual muscles of the core can resist that the forces that you're putting at it and maintain that static position to teach you how to better lock your core down and to get that functional exercise to those muscles specifically. Let's move on to the next core exercise. All right, so a step up on the pyramid when it comes to core training is we're going to be doing our dynamic isolated movements. Think of these as your traditional core exercises. Things like hanging leg raises, Russian twists, side bends, standing abs, more focused on the action of the muscles of the core as opposed to the function, which is the anti-movement, right? So again, I preface all of this with, if you have any sort of low back injury and any of these exercises hurt you or make your symptoms worse, don't do them. But this is something worth mentioning because for a lot of people, they can gain a lot of benefit from having this style of training for their core specifically. So hanging leg raises is a really, really good one because, again, it focuses on the front side of the core. Like we had mentioned with the Russian twists and all this, we have to be careful making sure that we don't overdo these, just like anything else. So if you're doing hanging leg raises, a few things we want to focus on is maintaining that good position and actually using our abs to curl our legs up. So I like to let it hang, right? And then you squeeze that pelvis underneath, feel the abs engage, bringing those knees up. Woo! Did these last night. Did about 1,000 last night. So very basic. This is a style of training that a lot of people should do, but they should not overdo because, again, some people have lower back injuries that may find these a little bit spicy. So that's number 2. Moving on to number 3. Let's go do it. All right, guys. So we went from our isolated exercises. Now we're going to start focusing on the integrated exercises. So first and foremost, we have our static integrated core exercises. When we talk integrated, we mean that the core is not the primary focus of the exercise, but rather it is a portion of the exercise that you'll be getting benefits from by doing it. So the example I have here is a single arm row. Think about this. The core in this exercise is trying to resist movement in, right? We want to make sure that our core is nice and tight, we're stabilizing everything, and we are resisting the movement and the motion through our midsection and making sure all that force is either going right into our upper back or more into our lat. Integrated exercises are great for either the upper body or the lower body. If I was going to focus on one for the lower body, we can do offset loads when it comes to split squats, right? We can be here, loading one side of the body. That's going to be kind of pulling us this way, so we have to resist that force. Again, working more on the functional end of the core as opposed to that action-oriented that we did with our hanging leg raises. Locking in, resisting that movement through all planes of motion, and there you go. These can also be farmer's walks, or suitcase carries rather. You can do waiter's carries, you can do front rack carries, overhead, anything where you're resisting force, that a weight is pulling you in one direction or the other, and you have to maintain a good position. Integrated exercises are really, really good if you have a solid foundation of understanding how to brace, understanding positioning, and just understanding what your core is supposed to be doing in an exercise. So moving on from our integrated static, let's go to the final piece, the most athletic piece, and the piece that requires the most prerequisite skill set to be able to do well. All right, guys, last but not least, we have integrated dynamic core work. This looks a lot like performing your sport if you're a field athlete, but also it can look a lot like med ball work. It can look a lot like throws. And it's something that a lot of people don't do correctly because they don't necessarily have that core control that you need to do it well. So integrated dynamic. Now, instead of trying to resist force through our core, we're trying to create it and actually push ourselves to go through that full range of motion and a little bit of that rotation to produce force. So I like to do med ball throws against a wall. I like to do overhead slams. I like to do rotational throws. This can also look a lot like landmine work, right? You're trying to rotate with a landmine. You're trying to create that force through that torso to be able to rocket you in the position and in the direction that you need to go. We did a really, really cool video on this specific type of training with Corey Schlesinger. We'll put that link up above. He has me doing a bunch of landmine stuff, a bunch of rotational stuff. It's really, really, really cool, and it's something that I think you guys need to check out. So for the last section here, let's go back to the whiteboard and figure out where and how you actually implement these exercises in your training. All right, guys, so that was a ton of information, and I hope that you kind of took some notes and followed along as best as you possibly could. So how do we use this information, and how do we use this sort of spectrum to figure out what we need specifically for our goals? So if you're going to be using this video to help determine what you need to kind of follow this plan. First and foremost, we need to make sure that we're looking at what the goal is. Is it a bigger squat? Is it a bigger deadlift? Is it to look better naked, right? You need to understand what that goal is and the demands required of that goal. If you're an athlete, this is a totally different conversation, but we still need to start with understanding what the demands of the sport are, what the demands of your season are, and at what point in the season that you're in. If you're general population, somebody that just wants to get stronger, you may have spend a little extra time dabbling in a little bit of everything. But if you're closer to your competitive season, you want to lock in on the things that will provide you with the most bang for your buck and give you the healthiest and strongest torso that you possibly can. Secondly, we need to figure out where you're at now, right? So a lot of people don't take the time to have real objective measures to determine where their strengths and weaknesses lie, especially when it comes to their core training. Is the core even a problem for you? How do you know? How do you determine that, right? Where are you failing lifts? Is it technical? Is it physical? Is it mental? You need to understand and have those objective measures when it comes to your training specifically to know if direct core training or indirect, more integrated core training will provide you with a better stimulus for your goal. Finally, you need to bridge the gap. If you have those objective measures of where you need to go and where you're starting out, it's much easier to pick the appropriate exercise so that you can, again, make the biggest leaps and bounds in your training, get as strong as you possibly can. So what if your goal, you're just general population, right? You're not training for anything competitive and you just want to have bigger lifts? I would say you should probably start dabbling a little bit in everything, right? If you start with a more direct, sort of a static exercise like the big three and you're really, really struggling, build that up. Build up your capacity to maintain those positions for longer periods of time. Because what happens after that is you start to build that strength, you start to build that skill set and that capacity, and your numbers start going up a little bit because your body can maintain better positions with greater and greater physical demands on it. Another thing that I forgot to mention, and I'll add it now, is this is only one component of core work. The spectrum that I went over is just one part. The other half is breathing, right? Your breath is massively important when it comes to training your core because that's a whole nother aspect. So for a lot of my clients that I work with and a lot of the athletes that I work with, I don't necessarily have them hold static lifts or the static core training for time. As the main focus, I use breathing because you can hold something, lock it in really, really tight for 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds, but as soon as you have to take big breaths in and big breaths out, you start to really take a lot of that pressure that you were able to build with that air pressure out of the equation, and now those muscles are starting to work even more. This is an awesome way to increase the demands of a very basic exercise and make it more challenging. So again, really focus on determining what you are training for, what your goals are, where you're at on that spectrum, and pick the necessary tools that you need to help better your goals. So guys, hopefully you got something out of this. Again, thank you to Dr. Shallow and Dr. McGill for all the information I've been able to gain through them, through the podcast, through me working with them as well. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you follow along, like, subscribe, do all the things. On behalf of myself and Jacob, who's not actually behind the camera right now, on behalf of this tripod, I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you guys in the next one.